All right, we're doing this shit a little different than normal, Jason.
Oh?
Yep. This is Dark Souls 2, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a long one, so I want to jump right in. But before we start, I want to lay out what I want to do here. All right?
Okay.
We're going to start this with basically like a 2-sentence review with the score for people who don't want any information about this game and want to just experience it for themselves.
Do it.
Then we're going to go on, and I'm going to talk impassionately about or dispassionately, or I don't know, something in there.
No, you're not.
About the game and its mechanics.
Yeah.
Okay? Then I'm going to talk about what I think about it. So there's 3 parts here, right?
Okay.
All right. Dark Souls 2. Here's your short version of it. It's got some problems. I don't know if it's quite as good as Dark Souls 1. I gave it 4.5 out of 5. It's not entirely perfect. It's got some warts on it. But if you want to just go experience this game without knowing anything about it, I highly recommend going to it, especially if you're a fan of Dark Souls.
South Park Stick of Truth is a better game than Dark Souls 2.
Fuck you. Shut up with that shit. Don't you encourage people for that?
No, you said that.
Oh.
You gave South Park Stick of Truth 5 stars.
Right.
You gave this 4.5 stars.
Right.
South Park Stick of Truth is a better game than Dark Souls 2.
That's not what you can't.
That's
that way lies madness. Madness.
I'm just 5 is better than 4.5.
It's not. You
right?
don't know. If you start down that road, then once you've
betrayed Dark Souls.
Okay, shut up. Shut up. Just shut up, all right? I'm going to get enough shit for this anyway. I don't need you on me as well.
It's logic.
All right. We're starting the actual review and talking about this. So Dark Souls 2 is the sequel to Dark Souls, and you play as a new cursed undead, which I don't know if you remember this from the first game, but basically you get the dark sign on you where every time you die, you come back and you're a little bit more dead until you go crazy. So your character is trying to essentially rid themselves of the curse of the dark sign. And you start out by coming through this portal in the opening sequence to this world where you meet the firekeepers from the previous Dark Souls games, these crones, the ones that were in the little house.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And they say, go to Drang Lake, and they know what's going on over there. So you run down the road, you walk up into this place called Majula that acts as your hub world. There you meet the Emerald Herald, who basically kind of gives you some pointers, and then it's off to the races, Dark Souls style, trying to figure out what the fuck you're supposed to do and where the fuck you're supposed to go.
Right.
So, this is odd because Dark Souls is not a sequel to Demon Souls.
Right.
This is the first time in the Soul series that this game is a sequel. It takes place years and years after the events of the original Dark Souls. Like, there are references back to things that happened in Dark Souls.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I actually feel like the game suffers a little bit from it. Because instead of being free to just kind of do their own world from scratch that takes influences like Dark Souls did with Demon Souls, there is a need to stick to certain parts of what is now the canon of Dark Souls and push that story forward. That instead of essentially reimagining the entire story over again with whatever new shit you want to come up with, you are in some cases beholden to the things that happened in the previous game because it is a sequel. I'll come back to that in the third part where I talk about me and Dark Souls. But let's talk about what you're doing in this game. This is pretty traditional from the Souls. You're running around, you're collecting souls, you're beating bosses, you're opening up new areas, all in the service of heading towards the end of the game. It's a little weird because in Dark Souls, I feel like your objectives were a little bit more clear-cut. Like, when you start out Dark Souls, they give you the setup for the world, and they give a little exposition, and then you go to this place, and the first person you meet at the Firelink Shrine says, go ring these 2 bells. Like, that's your goal. Whereas here, it's just like, I don't know if I wasn't paying enough attention, but the story gets rolled out in a much more kind of obtuse way. That
you were too busy rubbing yourself in the bathing suit area?
No. Well, punching myself in the bathing suit area,
hey, whatever it takes, man.
Whatever it takes. So you go forward into the game, and the game has a lot of parallels with both Demon Souls and Dark Souls in things that they've changed. And I feel like part of this review should basically just be a change log of what has changed between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. So there are good things. The things I think are good, there's the things I think are bad.
Okay.
All right. So in the original Dark Souls, you could level up at any bonfire that you went to. It's got the same set. I don't even know if should I tell people who've never played the game before kind of some of the structure of it.
Yes.
You've got these bonfires where, you've got a limited number of healing items. You're going between these bonfires that act as respawn points, but whenever you rest at them, it brings all the enemies that were behind you back to life, so you're kind of leapfrogging between these safe zones forward, and at all points the game is trying as hard as it can to just murder the ever-loving shit out of you from the very beginning. And a lot of times, the Souls games have a reputation for being really hard, but what that means, at least in my opinion, is that when you then overcome that difficulty, the reward is that much greater. It's kind of like when we talk about games that take a long time to get into, but once you get into them, the rewards are so much higher, like Dota or something like that.
Right.
High learning curve, but then a high payoff for going through that pain. And Dark Souls 2 actually does a little bit more babying than Dark Souls 1 does. Like when you come out of the opening area, in Dark Souls 1, the tutorial area was the Undead Asylum, and here there's this whole series of caves with tooltips that run you through a lot of stuff in the game, from all of your basic moves, and they basically have these rooms that just have like one guy in them, right? And there'll be a thing on the floor that says like, here's how you block, here's how you attack, here's a ranged guy, and blah 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 blah. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, they led you through this first part with no weapon, and the first thing that happened is the giant asylum demon comes down and fucking rips you a new one first thing. So the learning curve to get into the game is a little bit easier with that area. Like they've tried to cater to, I think, getting more people into the game by giving them an easier start instead of just throwing them right into the bullshit.
Sure.
Which is nice. I mean, I have to say that when I first played the game, I ran by all these fog doors that were in the beginning because I was like, I want to get over there.
Yeah.
And it was only after I've been playing the game for about 12 hours that I went back and I was like, oh, here's the tutorial. Fuck it, I didn't need that anyway.
But it's good that it makes it optional, though.
Right. So that if you are starting, like if you're doing a new game, you just run right past that part and you don't have to deal with any of that bullshit.
Because so many games, as we've complained about before, have this non-optional tutorial that you have to play through. Mm-hmm. And if you have the options, do you go through this door? No.
Right.
I'm a pro.
Right. Like you're playing the game for the 6th time.
Yeah.
And they're like, jam on the X button, open this door.
Right.
Here's one stupid enemy for you to kill. And here you just like, boom, right.
That's
past
smart
that.
of them.
So you get to Majula, which acts as your shrine, and then from there you move to other places. One of the biggest changes in this game, and I actually think the theme of this entire review is going to be that Dark Souls 2 is a game of trade-offs, right? So in Dark Souls 1, you had to run through the entire world until you got about half to two-thirds the way through the game, and then you would get this item that lets you warp between the different bonfires to different areas, lets you fast travel, essentially. Here, every time you light a bonfire, there is an option there that lets you quick travel from there to wherever, every other bonfire in the game that you've opened up. Which means that from the very beginning of the game, you are able to just pop all around to wherever you want to go. If you want to jump back here, you jump back there, jump back here. That's nice. It makes it easy for new players. It makes it quicker to get around the world. But I feel like the drawback from that is that the world of Dark Souls 1 was so meticulously put together in the way that it hooked into itself, where there were all of these switchbacks back and forth, because you had to have them, right? In the early game, you had to rely on shortcuts to get from here to here to here to here before you got to the point where you got that teleportation ability, the fast travel. Well, here, I feel like there isn't as much interconnectivity between the world. It actually feels a lot more like Dark Souls, where you have like kind of World 1-1, World 1-2. It's not quite that clear-cut, and there are still shortcuts in the game. It's just that, like, in Dark Souls 1, there were areas that were vertical, right, where you'd be on top of another area, and there would be places to go up and down and around here. Whereas by adding in the shortcut to the bonfires, you can quick travel, so it doesn't have to be that complicated. It doesn't have to be that interwoven. What that also means is that I feel like it's slightly less immersive, because you're not running through the same areas over and over again, looking at them, being familiar with where every enemy is. Because if you want to go from the starting area to level 7, you just go boop, level 7, and you're right there. So that's one of those things where it's both it's a trade-off, right? It's good and bad. There is weapon degradation that happens in between your bonfires. And the first game was like Diablo, right, where you're hitting guys, and if you just neglected your weapon, you had a durability that would go down. Eventually, it would get low, and your shit would break.
But it takes a while.
But it takes a while, and you would have to go back to a blacksmith in order to repair your weapon. Well, Dark Souls 1 was the same way, but in Dark Souls 2, there's a little. You saw it. There's a little meter below your weapon that every time you hit a guy, it makes the durability go down. And if it goes all the way down, it'll break. And so the thing is that if you rest at any bonfire and your weapon isn't broken, it'll regenerate that to full. But if it breaks, then you have to go back to one of the blacksmiths in the game and get it repaired. There's no way to repair it otherwise. There is a third way, or in the field,
that seems fair.
There's an item that you can use that will repair your stuff on the fly, but they're kind of limited, which is another thing I have to go into in a minute. So, once again, this is an interesting trade-off, because in Dark Souls 1, there were some weapons. There were like some katanas, especially. There's some weapons that have very low durability, or that would have special attacks that would really damage the durability of your weapon. But that didn't mean a whole lot, right? Because you just back up, you go to the nearest blacksmith, and you're good to go. Like the time that it took for your weapons to break down was enormous. Also, you could repair your weapons at any bonfire in Dark Souls 1. So in Dark Souls 2, what you end up with is that weapons that have a low durability are more like you want to save this for a boss encounter because this special weapon hurts people real bad. Mm-hmm. But if I use it for every enemy leading up to the boss, it's going to be broken by the time I get there. So once again, you've got a trade-off where that's a much more realistic representation of the way that weapon damage would actually work. On the other hand, I feel like in Dark Souls, in Demon Souls, in the Souls series, you develop a relationship with your weapon. A lot of people don't get into the game until they finally find the weapon that, like, oh shit, I finally found the one that works for me, right? Yeah. So here,
which is kind of realistic, really, because throughout history, weapons were important, and a well-made weapon was something that had a bit of gravity attached to it.
So what I ended up doing in the game was I ended up upgrading 2 or 3 different weapons and then switching them out while I was going through. But it's a little weird because you can equip up to 3 weapons now in each hand. It used to be you can only do 2. You can switch out your left hand and your right hand. You can equip up to 3 weapons, but each one of those weapons you equip affects your equip load, which affects how fast you run, how fast your stamina goes down, and how fast you're able to roll. So you find yourself, if you're going to have multiple weapons, having to go into the menus to switch them out instead of just being like, well, here's my sub-weapon that I'm going to use, because that's going to affect your movement speed. I don't know. This is all very granular, and I feel like this is the part where people from the Soul series are going to know what I'm talking about.
Those of you listening, did you expect anything else?
Your eyes just kind of glaze over. You're like, I don't fucking care.
Yeah, I forgot where I was for a minute.
I think that when I first saw that mechanic, I didn't really like it, and I think that I would have liked it way less if not for, let's go to the next thing, the fact that there are a lot of vendors in this game that have a very limited number of items. So, like, there's a repair powder that you can use to repair your weapons, right? But in the beginning, the blacksmith sells it, and he's got, like, 5 of them or something like that. So if you use that and then you die a whole lot and you run out of that stuff, we've kind of boned at that point.
Yeah.
You're going to need to switch to a different weapon or go to your second choice or whatever. And I feel like if they would have let you buy, like, there were vendors in the original Dark Souls that had unlimited things. Some of them have a limited number of things, some of them have an unlimited number. And here, later on in the game, you unlock vendors that will sell you unlimited this or unlimited that. But in the beginning, resources are scarce, so it makes the early game, I think, seem harder, because if you're not using your souls the right way, or you're losing large amounts of souls, it can be much more damaging to you overall as a player. Which segues nicely into the fact that there's another thing that I told you about that when I first saw it made my fucking jaw drop, and that is that enemies in this game, you can kill them to extinction now. Like, you can kill the same enemy enough times in a map, they're gone. They don't come back. And I read something somewhere from one of the developers that said that they did this because they didn't want people farming an area for souls. They want them to move on to another area.
Yeah.
Once again, this is another case of It's good and bad at the same time.
Right.
Because sometimes when you're trying to run from the nearest bonfire to the boss, and the boss keeps whooping your ass, totally happened to me, you are running and just killing the same people over and over again. It's just a grind, right?
Yeah.
There's 25 guys in between me and the boss. I can't turn my back on them. I need to kill each one of them in turn. And I get to the boss. I fight him for a few minutes, and he kills me. So now I got to go all the way back.
Start it all over
right.
again.
So eventually, when you're doing that, you get to the point where you're just running through the area because there's no guys left.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that means that you can't grind for upgrade materials, you can't grind for drops, you can't grind for souls, which makes the loss of a lot of souls a much more delicate thing. Because in Dark Souls, you could lose a billion jillion souls, right? And it was shitty, but eventually you got to a point where you're like, I'm going to get them back. Who cares? You know, like there's places you can go and grind the enemies where they drop a certain number of souls, and you can build back up the cachet that you need to do that upgrade. Whereas here, knowing that there's a limited number of enemies, that starts to become a little bit more dire when you lose those souls because, you know, I got this from farming this area. Now there are no more people left in this area. Like, what the fuck? You know, what the actual fuck?
Right.
So, once again, you've got a trade-off there. And the other thing about that is that I think I would have appreciated if the game would have given me a little bit of a heads up about that. Like if some NPC had said, hey, bro, the monsters here are limited. Because the first time that it happened, I was like, what?
One of them ran up to you and said, you are committing genocide. Stop.
Let my people go.
Yeah.
So once again, a bit of a trade-off. The whole thing is the whole game is full of trade-offs like that. Like you can now be invaded in the game if you're in Souls, or even if you're not. Okay, so in Dark Souls, you were either human or you were undead. You had two states of being. In this game, they've changed it so that it's more of a gradual degradation. So every time you die, your health gets cut by 10%. And your character becomes a little bit more undead looking. And eventually, the lowest it'll go is 50%. There's actually a ring that you can get that'll raise that back up to like 75%. So it's not a huge detriment.
Yeah.
But you can be invaded now at any time, even if you're dead. So, even I'm not dead, hollowed, right? Even if you're down to 50%.
Right.
It used to be that if you were hollowed, you could not be invaded.
Right.
Now you can be. Which sucks because, like, at one point, there's okay, check this out. At one point in the game, you walk up to this guy, and he's like, hey, whatever you do, don't go hit that switch over there. I'm serious, don't go hit that switch over there. I'm like, okay. So then I walk up to the switch, and like in Demon Souls, there's all these messages on the floor.
Yeah.
And every one of them says, don't do it. Don't do it. Stop. Turn back. Don't do it. And I walk up, and I'm like, fuck it. Pull it. And spoiler, very, very minor spoiler here, you guys. What happens when you do that is that there's this asshole NPC invader phantom that now just starts invading you all the fucking time. And like I can barely get rid of him. And he always shows up at the most inopportune time to whoop my ass. I'm just like, oh, God damn it. I didn't even know why he was doing it until I went and looked it up. And I was like, oh, it's because I hit that lever that everybody was saying. Don't do this. So once again, lots of different trade-offs in the game. Here's another one. In Dark Souls, they give you 5 of the healing Estus flasks when you start out the game, right? And you go, every time you hit a bonfire, those 5 Estus flasks refill back up to 5. You can take not Firekeeper Souls, you can take Humanity in the game, in Dark Souls 1, and burn it to get more flasks. You can get up to 10, and then eventually you unlock 15 and 20. Here, when you get to the Emerald Herald in the first area, she gives you 1 Estus flask. And then as you play through the game, you find a shards of the flask. And when you give those to her, she ups it to 2 to 3 to 4, whatever.
Sure.
This is one of those mechanics where I go, this is fucking stupid. So to counteract this, when you drink a flask in Dark Souls, it refills your health, right?
Right.
There are enemies that actually drop these life gems that you can equip where if you use them, it will gradually refill your health. Instead of just like zoop back up again, it like goes up over time slowly. So when you first start the game, you're kind of reliant on using those gems instead of the Estus flasks until you get more of them. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really seem to matter all that much. Because like by the time I hit the mid-game, I had like 6 or 7 flasks. and I just stopped using the other ones because they were a limited resource. And I'm like, eventually I'm going to run out of these. It would be better to just learn how to use the ones that I've got that constantly regenerate instead of using the life gems. So that's one of those things that I don't really quite get and was a little bit irritating to me. I gotta stop. I gotta do a few more things and then go to story and then wrap this up and then do my other part because we're already at 20 minutes.
Wrap it up.
No,
wrap it up.
A few more things. Bringing other people into your game.
Yeah.
This is another thing that I'm not especially super fond of. So in Dark Souls, you would find humanity items, and if you had the expansion of the game, there's actually a place you could go to farm humanity items. There were some enemies that would drop humanity that would turn you back to human, and you had to be human to summon people into your game. Here you have a human effigy that you use that turns you back fully human, or you can go into other people's games and help them, and every time you help them, you turn human. Now, one of the... Actually, I'm going to go off on a... No, okay.
No more tangents.
Well, it's something people need to know. But the human effigies seem also to kind of be a limited resource. And if you're not in the right summon range for people to bring you into their game, like if you're level 20 and I'm level 120, you can't summon me to your game to fight the second level boss because they're just like, I will fuck that shit directly up.
Right.
But the problem is, since the game is brand new, I didn't have a friendly guide online that says you should be this level when you fight this guy, you should be this level when you fight this guy.
Yep.
So what I found was that once I learned the enemies didn't respawn, I started to become really covetous of holding on to souls. So as soon as I got my souls, I would go back and upgrade the shit out of myself, which meant that by about 2/3 of the way through the game, I had wrecked the ability to bring other people into my game because I was just too high level.
Yeah.
And I played the game out of order, like I always end up doing. I missed this one first part, and I ended up playing through the second third of the game before I had finished the first quarter of the game, and then going back later on to figure out where the fuck I messed up. So since that resource is somewhat limited and it's somewhat tenuous, I felt like it was harder to get other people into my game, which was kind of a bummer because I like playing with other people. They make the game more fun. They make it easier. And one of the other weird things that comes with the multiplayer in this is that it used to be that when you put a summon sign down on the ground, right, you would summon another person into your game, and that person would be in your game from that point until you beat the boss.
Yeah.
So the protocol in Dark Souls was you would put your summon signs down as close to the last bonfire, to the closest bonfire to the boss.
Yeah.
You bring those people in, and then they would run you through the level up to the boss and then help you fight the boss.
Right.
Well, now summon signs have a time limit. So when you bring somebody into your game, they're there for a certain amount of time. And if you don't kill the boss, eventually it'll just say duty fulfilled on their screen, and then they go back to their world. So if you just dick around... No. So now, most of those summon signs that I saw are right outside of where the boss is. That's where people are putting their stuff down, which means that you need to fight through the entire level by yourself before getting there.
Well, that's kind of the point, though, right? Of the first one, anyway.
You know, I when I first played Dark Souls, I thought that was the point, but it's really like having people help you. Like, if that was the mechanic that they wanted, they could have done it differently than letting you put down a summon sign, right? Because if you want to play with your friends, you don't want to just call them in for every boss fight. You want to bring them in to soak up some of the damage of the level while you're going up to the boss. So by the time you get to the boss, none of you are as hurt as you would have been if you did it all by yourself. Plus, you can bring people in that are more knowledgeable about the level and stuff like that. I like that system better. And here it seemed like everybody was putting their stuff down just right before the boss. So it made the experience a little bit less cooperative. Which I feel is kind of weird. Mm-hmm. And I didn't necessarily like it. There's also didn't seem like there was much of a timer. There wasn't like a timer or anything that would tell you when they were going to go away. Like, oh shit, we got a minute left. We need to get on this, right? Also,
all of a sudden, it would just be duty fulfilled.
Yeah, boom, and then they're out. Yeah. They also changed it so that it used to be that characters that you summoned into your game could not heal themselves. The only way that they could be healed was if you drank one of your healing items, it would heal them.
Okay.
There were a few items they could use, like they could use humanity to get their health back, but it was up to you. Like, it was up to them to take the hits, and it was up to you to make sure that they stayed alive. Like, you were kind of the overseer, and they were your little minions, right, until you got to the boss. And that relationship has been changed by the fact that they can now use their own healing items when they come into your game. So I feel like those two methods that I just described were there to draw players closer together. And in this case, it feels much more utilitarian because they can operate on their own.
Yeah.
They can, they're mostly there to just help you with bosses, and that's it. There's a few other things in the game that have changed when you use, this is just some side notes, when you use magic, you now use up stamina, which is important. There are now items that you can buy that will let you refill your spell charges so that you can have a much more pure mage build, because it used to be you had 30 shots of this until you hit the next bonfire. So if you're at the one before the boss, you need to fight with the piddly dagger until you get to the boss because you can't refill them.
Right.
That's cool. There are a bunch of different set pieces in this game. They've revamped the way that covenants work, and I think that there's some interesting new ones. Like the Covenant of the Blue is specifically where if you get your game invaded, you bring one of those guys in to help you out. Like they get auto-summoned into your game to help you defend against the invader. That's pretty cool. There are a lot of references back to the original Dark Souls, and if you're into this sort of game, the lore of the world is interesting. I'm still not entirely, I've sussed a lot of it out.
Yeah.
But this is one of those things where if I had to wait to do a review until I fully understood the lore of Dark Souls 2, we would never do a review. I mean, I was still finding shit out years after I played the original Dark Souls. So that's where I'm going to cut it off for review purposes.
You could probably talk for another couple of hours, couldn't you?
There's a lot of changes in here. There's also it seems like they've changed combat a little bit, like just standard melee combat.
What do you give it?
I already did. 4.5 out of 5.
I was wondering if you would change your mind.
No, same as before.
All right. Well, thanks a lot.
No, we're not done yet. Oh, actually, you know what? There's a couple of other things. There's
Oh, here we go.
Some of the reasons that I wanted to. There were a couple things where sometimes when you bring up like the menus and stuff in the game, there's like lag while it fills stuff in. There were a few places where I would talk to somebody and there would be lag before the conversation things come up. In places where I wouldn't really expect there to be lag.
Weird.
There were a few technical weirdness things. There's some cases where they've changed certain types of weapon profiles and the way that certain weapons work that I just didn't really care for. On the other hand, they made upgrading a whole hell of a lot easier.
Yeah.
There's even an item in the game now that lets you respec your character. So if you fuck it all up and you're level 100, and I just want to go back and do all this over again.
That is strangely forgiving.
There's like 4 or 5 of these items in the game where you take them to a character and she will let you just get all your points back and try a different way, which is cool. Very cool. Now, as for me, I don't like this game as much as Dark Souls.
Oh, no.
And one of the reasons that I don't like, and I went into this, and I had a lot of fluctuating opinions as I played this game.
Yeah.
Dark Souls is, in my opinion, a darker game.
Yeah.
Like when you go from, you start out in the Undead Asylum, which is it's a gross, it's full of these monsters and shit.
Yeah.
And then this bird picks you up and he takes you to this ruined area.
Asylum's bad enough. Undead is bad enough. Undead Asylum,
Not so good.
very bad.
Well, it's even worse when you find out that you're there because you are undead. But you go to this place. In Dark Souls, let me put it this way. In Dark Souls, there's the stories in the Souls series are told by talking to people at various points throughout the game. So you'll talk to this guy, and then later on you'll find him in another area, you can talk to him there, and he'll give you another little piece of his story. In Dark Souls 2, most of the time you just talk to somebody, and then eventually they come back to your hub area, and then you can talk to them there to get the story. In Dark Souls 1, spoiler, almost every person that you meet is on the road to madness and death. Like their intentions are good. They're noble people who are here in this land trying to make a difference. And almost every single one of them eventually goes crazy, and they will try to attack your character, and you have no choice but to murder them. People that have given you personal details of their lives and things like that. And they're hidden. They're out there in this world. I didn't get that out of this game. Like, even the first area, you start in this field, and you go to this house with the women, and you go to this area, and you're going towards a giant crack in this wall of the world, right? And when you go through this crack, you come to your hub area, Majula, where the sun is setting, and there's a sea, and it's this very yellow area, and you talk to the Emerald Herald, who's this beautiful woman in this green, there's a lot of color there. You talk to this. In Dark Souls, it was oppressive. It was dark. It was it was fucked up in like a lot of different ways. And that's the thing that I missed in Dark Souls 2.
Yeah.
Was that there are things in here. Like, I don't want to make it seem like there aren't stories in here, but like Dark Souls 1, you go back in time, you find these people who are monsters because their humanity has run rampant and they've grown into these mutated creatures. In Dark Souls 1, you find these hideous Cthulhu-like creatures with tentacles coming out of their heads, and then you find out that they're actually the handmaidens of the queen that this mad dragon experimented on, and you only find this out because in the corner there are two of these monsters, but they won't attack you. They're just weeping and inconsolable.
Yeah. Dark Souls 2, it's like, pet this puppy or do not.
Well, there are a lot of enemies in Dark Souls 2 that were just kind of variants on, like, here's a dude. He's kind of weird and fucked up looking.
Right.
Like in Dark Souls 1, and there's going to be some spoilers here. In Dark Souls 1, you've seen him in the intro. There's Grave Lord Nito, who's this mass of skeletons, right? Yeah. He's just really grotesque looking. In Dark Souls 2, there's a boss called the Rotten that is this fat mass of people that have all been smooshed together into this thing. And like when you go into Gravelord Nito's lair, it's this crypt that's just full of all these skeletons and grotesquerie. Here, that encounter with the Rotten is very different. He's just in this room. There's this fire. He's making these poison traps, and you're just like, the one was like one of the four lords of this world, and the other one is just, I don't really even know. He's just this grotesque thing. Or in Dark Souls 1, there's a moment where you fight this giant wolf, and when you get the wolf down below like 60 or 70% health, it starts limping away from you. Like, it's hurt. It's this giant dog with a giant sword. It's limping away from you, trying to get away from you. And you have no choice but to kill it. Like, there's no way out. And I was like, I spent 10 minutes trying to figure out, how do I leave here?
Right.
I don't want to kill that dog. He's not even attacking me anymore. I just want to get away from it. Well, the same thing happens in this game, but it's a giant rat that you're fighting. A giant diseased rat that starts limping away from you. I'm like,
easier to kill.
Fuck you, rodent face. Like, I don't give a shit.
You're not a dog.
Right. And there is good imagery in Dark Souls 2. There is interesting stuff happening in there, but I think that I'll remember the stories from Dark Souls 1 a lot more. And when it comes down to it, is that when you look at the two games mechanically, Dark Souls 1 is maybe a little bit snappier. I like the enemy design in it a little bit more, but they're fairly comparable. What it really comes down to me for the difference between the 5 stars of Dark Souls 1 and the 4.5 of Dark Souls 2 is that Dark Souls 2 or Dark Souls 1 seemed like a darker game.
Yeah.
You know, Dark Souls 2, the world of Dark Souls 2 seems to have more hope. It seems to have more light in it. It seems to be a world that is not as dying as Dark Souls 1, in the fact that like the things that you see in that world seem like they're less fucked up than the things that you see in Dark Souls 2. And I'm saying that even though Dark Souls 2 had a giant fucking spider boss, all right? Which people were like, how'd you like that? And I'm like, I didn't care
I didn't
for
like it at all.
I wasn't especially fond of it. So when it comes down to, for me, is the fact that just from a narrative, fictional, like a flavor sense, right? Dark Souls 1 had more of a oppressive sense of misery and despair than Dark Souls 2. Like, Dark Souls 2 felt like it was hard. Like, things like the weapon degradation felt like they were hard because people were like, you guys want this to be hard, right?
Right.
We're making it harder. And in some cases, they've eased up in certain areas. In some cases, they're harder. But in Dark Souls 1, that difficulty felt like the world, like the death of a world pressing in on you as a character when you would talk to these people and hear their stories and then murder them before the game was over. That was something that will stick with me. And those stories, the characters of Dark Souls 1, you know, fucking Lautrec and Iron Tarkus and Solaire, you know, all these characters that are in that game, the Firekeepers and you know, just Patches the Hyena. I can't even believe that Patches isn't really in Dark Souls 2. Like, these are characters that I will remember a lot longer than I'll remember the Emerald Herald.
Anything from Dark
Souls 2.
Yeah.
And that's just me. That's just where I'm coming from. If you like it, I'm not trying to tell you not to like it. Honestly, I'm not. But for me, it's a good game. I spent about 45 hours straight playing it. I'm probably going to go back and play it more, but it's just not quite, it didn't grab me as hard as the original did. And I think it's because it's a sequel instead of a reimagining.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's what I thought about it, and I don't know. Maybe we can do something else in the future if there's more that needs to be said about it. There's plenty I didn't even get to in the review about it, about other mechanics.
Seriously?
That I feel like people would need to know, but I'm not gonna talk about it. I'm not gonna talk about it.
I'm tired of hearing the words dark and souls together.
Are you ready to hear the words metal and gear together for the next 6 months?
Be careful what you wish for.